Hello and welcome to the Peppermint Sunflower channel, where we pair video of the beautiful natural world with calming narration of classic literature. Chapter 43 introduces us to another character on the Tremolino, the nephew of Dominic. And now, over to Joseph Conrad. Anyway, he was perfect, as Doña Rita had declared. The only thing unsatisfactory, and even inexplicable, about our Dominic was his nephew, César. It was startling to see a desolate expression of shame veil the remorseless audacity in the eyes of that man superior to all scruples and terrors. "I would never have dared to bring him on board your balancelle," he once apologised to me. "But what am I to do? His mother is dead, and my brother has gone into the bush." In this way I learned that our Dominic had a brother. As to going into the bush, this only means that a man has done his duty successfully in the pursuit of a hereditary vendetta. The feud which had existed for ages between the families of Cavoni and Brunaschi was so old that it seemed to have smouldered out at last. One evening Pietro Brunaschi, after a laborious day amongst his olive trees, sat on a chair against the wall of his house with a bowl of broth on his knees and a piece of bread in his hand. Dominic's brother, going home with a gun on his shoulder, found a sudden offence in this picture of content and rest, so obviously calculated to awaken the feelings of hatred and revenge. He and Pietro had never had any personal quarrel, but, as Dominic explained, all our dead cried out to him. He shouted from behind a wall of stones, "Oh, Pietro, behold what is coming!" And as the other looked up innocently, he took aim at the forehead and squared the old vendetta account so neatly that, according to Dominic, the dead man continued to sit with the bowl of broth on his knees and the piece of bread in his hand. This is why, because in Corsica your dead will not leave you alone, Dominic's brother had to go into the marquee, into the bush on the wild mountainside, to dodge the gendarmes for the insignificant remainder of his life, and Dominic had charge of his nephew, with a mission to make a man of him. No more unpromising undertaking could be imagined. The very material for the task seemed wanting. The Cavonis, if not handsome men, were good, sturdy flesh and blood. But this extraordinarily lean and livid youth seemed to have no more blood in him than a snail. "Some cursed witch must have stolen my brother's child from the cradle and put that spawn of a starved devil in its place," Dominic would say to me. "Look at him, just look at him." To look at César was not pleasant. His parchment skin, showing dead white on his cranium through the thin wisps of dirty brown hair, seemed to be glued directly and tightly upon his big bones. Without being in any way deformed, he was the nearest approach which I have ever seen or could imagine to what is commonly understood by the word monster. That the source of the effect produced was really moral, I have no doubt. An utterly, hopelessly depraved nature was expressed in physical terms that, taken each separately, had nothing positively startling. You imagined him clammily cold to the touch, like a snake. The slightest reproof, the most mild and justifiable remonstrance, would be met by a resentful glare and an evil shrinking of his thin, dry upper lip, a snarl of hate to which he generally added the agreeable sound of grinding teeth. It was for this venomous performance, rather than for his lies, impudence and laziness, that his uncle used to knock him down. It must not be imagined that it was anything in the nature of a brutal assault. Dominic's brawny arm would be seen describing deliberately an ample horizontal gesture, a dignified sweep, and César would go over suddenly like a ninepin, which was funny to see. But once down he would writhe on the deck, gnashing his teeth in impotent rage, which was pretty horrible to behold. And it also happened more than once that he would disappear completely, which was startling to observe. This is the exact truth. Before some of these majestic cuffs, César would go down and vanish. He would vanish heels over head into open hatchways, into scuttles, behind upended casks, according to the place where he happened to come into contact with his uncle's mighty arm. Once, it was in an old harbour, just before Tremolino's last voyage. He vanished thus overboard, to my infinite consternation. Dominic and I had been talking business together aft, and César had sneaked up behind us to listen, for, amongst his other perfections, he was a consummate eavesdropper and spy. At the sound of the heavy plop alongside, horror held me rooted to the spot, but Dominic stepped quietly to the rail and leaned over, waiting for his nephew's miserable head to bob up for the first time. "Oh, hey, César!" he yelled contemptuously to the spluttering wretch. "Catch hold of that mooring hawser, sure on ya!" He approached me to resume the interrupted conversation. "What about César?" I asked anxiously. "Canalia, let him hang there," was his answer. And he went on talking over the business in hand calmly, while I tried vainly to dismiss from my mind the picture of César steeped to the chin in the water of the old harbour, a decoction of centuries of marine refuse. I tried to dismiss it because the mere notion of that liquid made me feel very sick. Presently Dominic, hailing an idle boatman, directed him to go and fish his nephew out, and by and by César appeared, walking on board from the quay, shivering, steaming with filthy water, with bits of rotten straws in his hair, and a piece of dirty orange peel stranded on his shoulder. His teeth chattered, his yellow eyes squinted balefully at us as he passed forward. I thought it my duty to remonstrate. "Why are you always knocking him about, Dominic?" I asked. Indeed, I felt convinced it was no earthly good, a sheer waste of muscular force. "I must try to make a man of him," Dominic answered hopelessly. I restrained the obvious retort that in this way he ran the risk of making, in the words of the immortal Mantalini, a demnition damp unpleasant corpse of him. "He wants to be a locksmith," burst out Cavoni. "To learn to pick locks, I suppose," he added with sardonic bitterness. "Why not let him be a locksmith?" I ventured. "Who would teach him?" he cried. "Where could I leave him?" he asked with a drop in his voice, and I had my first glimpse of genuine despair. "He steals, you know, alas. Partant mordant. I believe he would put poison in your food and mine. The viper!" He raised his face and both his clenched fists slowly to heaven. However, César never dropped poison into our cups. One cannot be sure, but I fancy he went to work in another way. This voyage, of which the details need not be given, we had to range far afield for sufficient reasons. Coming up from the south to end it with the important and really dangerous part of the scheme in hand, we found it necessary to look into Barcelona for certain definite information. This appears like running one's head into the very jaws of the lion, but in reality it was not so. We had one or two high influential friends there, and many others humble but valuable because bought for good hard cash. We were in no danger of being molested. Indeed, the important information reached us promptly by the hands of a customs house officer, who came on board full of showy zeal to poke an iron rod into the layer of oranges which made the visible part of our cargo in the hatchway. I forgot to mention before that the Tremolino was officially known as a fruit and corkwood trader. The zealous officer managed to slip a useful piece of paper into Dominic's hand as he went ashore, and a few hours afterwards, being off duty, he returned on board again athirst for drinks and gratitude. He got both, as a matter of course. While he sat sipping his liqueur in the tiny cabin, Dominic plied him with questions as to the whereabouts of the guarda-costas. The preventative service afloat was really the one for us to reckon with, and it was material for our success and safety to know the exact position of the patrol craft in the neighbourhood. The news could not have been more favourable. The officer mentioned a small place on the coast some 12 miles off where, unsuspicious and unready, she was lying at anchor, with her sails unbent, painting yards and scraping spars. Then he left us after the usual compliments, smirking reassuringly over his shoulder. I had kept below pretty close all day from excess of prudence. The stake played on that trip was big. "We are ready to go at once, but for César, who has been missing ever since breakfast," announced Dominic to me in his slow, grim way. Where the fellow had gone and why, we could not imagine. The usual surmises in the case of a missing seaman did not apply to César's absence. He was too odious for love, friendship, gambling, or even casual intercourse. But once or twice he had wandered away like this before. Dominic went ashore to look for him, but returned at the end of 2 hours alone and very angry, as I could see by the token of the invisible smile under his moustache being intensified. We wondered what had become of the wretch, and made a hurried investigation amongst our portable property. He had stolen nothing. "He will be back before long," I said confidently. 10 minutes afterwards, one of the men on deck called out loudly, "I can see him coming!" César had only his shirt and trousers on. He had sold his coat, apparently for pocket money. "You knave," was all Dominic said with a terrible softness of voice. He restrained his collar for a time. "Where have you been, vagabond?" he asked menacingly. Nothing would induce César to answer that question. It was as if he even disdained to lie. He faced us, drawing back his lips, gnashing his teeth, and did not shrink an inch before the sweep of Dominic's arm. He went down as if shot, of course. But this time I noticed that, when picking himself up, he remained longer than usual on all fours, baring his big teeth over his shoulder and glaring upwards at his uncle with a new sort of hate in his round yellow eyes. That permanent sentiment seemed pointed at that moment by especial malice and curiosity. I became quite interested. If he ever manages to put poison in the dishes, I thought to myself, this is how he will look at us as we sit at our meal. But I did not, of course, believe for a moment that he would ever put poison in our food. He ate the same things himself. Moreover, he had no poison, and I could not imagine a human being so blinded by cupidity as to sell poison to such an atrocious creature. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed both the chapter and the video. If you have any suggestions for classic books you would like to hear read on this channel, please drop a note in the comments below. Episodes are uploaded every Sunday. Please do subscribe to make sure you don't miss them.